You're listening to Music Tectonics.
Hi there, and welcome to Music Tectonics, the podcast that goes beneath the surface to discover everything that's shaking at the intersection of music and tech. I'm your host for today, Tristra Newyear Yeager, Director of Strategy at Rock Paper Scissors, the music tech PR firm. Today we're going to explore a really interesting field of musicology and sonic research, namely ecomusicology and acoustic ecology. These fields of study can inform and guide the way we think about music tech. For example, we can explore questions like how does sound define spaces and their distinct characteristics? How can we learn to appreciate, understand, and respect the sound of the features, creatures, and places around us? And as we develop tech to generate more and more artificial or synthetic soundscapes, what do we really need to know and what do we need to keep in mind? To give us a deeper grounding in some of the basics we might need to answer these questions, we're joined today by AnneMaries Shaver, a flutist, doctoral candidate in ecomusicology, and member of the Acoustic Ecology Lab at Arizona State University. I'll tell you a little bit more about AnneMaries' background and her research direction, but I'm also going to let her tell you more about that in just a second. But AnneMaries is drawing on research in environmental humanities, acoustic ecology, and sound studies. She explores sound, listening, and public creative placekeeping. She investigates the cultural role of environmental sound, new ways to engage with sonic environments, and the benefits of listening to one's surroundings. So thanks so much for joining us today, AnneMaries. I'm really excited.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So I'm going to start out with pretty much the most boring, basic question, which is, what exactly is ecomusicology? What questions as a field of study does it attempt to ask and answer?
This is a great question, and I will try my best not to get as into the weeds of explaining it. The short definition is that ecomusicology is the study of music, culture, and nature. Now, of course, each of those terms has a huge history with it. There's so much baggage and so many discussions around each term. For music example, what does that mean to this person versus another person? Are we including sound in our definition of music? Are we doing noise? So just as you can imagine, very wide, very diverse options when it comes to ecomusicology. It's a very complex field to bring together that music, nature, culture combination. And there are a lot of facets, we'll say, that tackle those questions of music and sound as it relates to the environment. For example, there's zoomusicology, also called biomusic, and this really considers non-human animal sounds like bird songs, whale songs, and places them in relation to human musicality. Also places them outside of human musicality and within their own context of the animal musicking. Interspecies music making is another subset of zoomusicology. I do think it's important to recognize Stephen Feld's influence on this field. He is an ethnomusicologist and does research on sound and place. The term that he has coined is acousticology, and that's really just a fancy way of combining acoustics and epistemology. The main point with Feld is he's positing that sound is a way of knowing. And many ecomusicologists, acoustic ecologists are reliant and often refer to his term. So if you want something to anchor you, Stephen Feld's acousticology is a good place to start. But there's also research on how environments may impact a composer and the music they're composing. There are also sustainability concerns within the field. For example, what wood or materials are we making instruments out of, and can we do that long term? What about music distribution? What is the impact globally of cassettes, of CDs, of streaming services? So you can see that there's this activism aspect in place here as well. It's very common to come to issues of pollution, climate change, animal rights, that type of thing in connection with music. John Luther Adams is a composer very much so worth listening to. He has a background in environmentalism, and his music is also tackling some of those issues. And then in my own research, like you said, ecomusicology for me is attached to acoustic ecology, soundscapes, sound walking. And just to give a easy definition of soundscapes, it's just the study of sounds in a particular place considered in a context or as an ecosystem. And I do think it's important to note that soundscapes can be natural, quote unquote natural, or urban. And those labels do perpetuate a binary that I'm not super excited about, but it's a way to conceptualize of soundscapes, including everything, not just what we think of as the natural world. And acoustic ecology is very much so associated with soundscape and soundscape studies. And that's associated with Canadian composer AnneMaries Schaefer. He wrote a book called The Tuning of the World that has been very influential. And he also had a World Soundscape project that he was involved in that really coined a lot of the key terms that are still used in ecomusicology and acoustic ecology. He was very concerned with noise pollution, and he was and remains a somewhat problematic figure in his erasure of certain voices and points of views and sounds, but he is definitely recognized as a main figure. But to recap, the short definition of ecomusicology is the study of music, culture, and nature.
That's really fascinating. I kind of want to go back to a term that you dropped as you were describing what the field can encompass. And namely, I loved the term, was it sound walking?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit more about, so in some ways, sound walking sounds like a great way to get to know sound. And we'll talk about how do we know via sound in a second. But how does sound walking work, and what's its role in just understanding the ecology, the audio ecology of a location?
Yeah. So sound walking is taking a walk with the intention of listening. And movement is in my opinion, can be a key part of the listening process. Of course, there is a time and space for stationary listening, but the sound walking element, I think, helps you ground a little bit into this space and experience the sounds in a different way. And that's really what all of this is about, is how can we open and encourage more ways of listening. But sound walking, I think, is a really wonderful practice, in that you do get to experience spaces. You pass through them in a way that is intentional, that is connected. And I think personally, sound walking can lead to a connection within yourself. Like, it's a time it can be meditative and reflective. If you want to take some time to think, how am I receiving this sound? Where in my body am I receiving this sound? It just gets you in touch with your own experiences. But also, if you're walking continuously in a certain place, like my co-founder of the sound walking program at Arizona State University, he and I were doing sound walks weekly on campus. So we got to experience, like, oh yeah, there's that loud tree that's just full of 12,000 birds. And, we got to know the bird tree because we walked past it every week. And that's also part of this, is if you have a regular listening practice, you can experience the changes of seasons, of growth, of whatever it may be. But sound walking is a great way to move through spaces in a way that facilitates that listening and that connection.
That's really interesting and compelling. And I love the idea of a bird tree. I'm kind of a bird fanatic over here.
Yeah. We walked around the tree, not under the tree.
It's great too when you go to a new city or a new part of the country, a new part of the world. That's one of the first things I think you can notice if you go outside, maybe early in the morning before the traffic noise is there, is you'll hear these new birds. And you're like, what is that? Like, so that's always for me, a very exciting moment. But getting back to how, in some ways, the sound walking process or any process of deep listening is tuning into how we know via sound, what we can learn, not just in terms of sheer information, but sort of how the auditory experience contributes to our understanding of who we are, what the world is. I'm wondering how ecomusicology or acoustic ecology addresses that point. I mean, we don't need to get too deep into epistemology or philosophical concerns that have absorbed humans since probably the dawn of time. But how are these questions being sort of framed nowadays in your field?
Yeah, there are different ways. So, for example, to use the Acoustic Ecology Lab as a reference, they have done work in VR, and their project is called Eco-Rift, and it's an initiative that uses nature settings and sounds typically for healing purposes, or that's one application. So it takes still images, 360 images, and sound recordings from national parks and preserves from all around the world. And it uses like Oculus head tracking to mimic reality positionality, essentially. So if you're in this space in the headset and you hear a bird behind you and kind of to the right, and then you turn your head to that space, now the bird is going to be sounding in front of you. And some of the people who have used this have said they've seen something move, but it's a still image. So to me, that's indicating that sound is really an important part of building this realistic environment. So that has applications for AR, VR, like you were saying.
Wow.
And also, yeah, it's fascinating. And one related note, there was a project done by a lab member, Naomi Chen. Her initial studies with the VR, specifically with the aging population, showed that there was a correlation with positive well-being, which is also well documented. People who have a window in a hospital can heal faster in some cases than without the window. So related to existing research in that way.
That's fascinating. I also love how the visual and audio processing are always so tied together, right? So if you hear a sound and you can't see the source, you can, the positionality gets confused, et cetera. It's super interesting. All right, we're going to take a very quick break in our conversation, and we'll be right back.
South by Southwest is back in person and face-to-face in Austin, Texas. Will you be there? The Music Tectonics team is convening the official Music Tech meetup at South by. It takes place March 16th, 2022 at 11:30 a.m. local Austin time. It's at the Austin Convention Center. Dimitri will be your host, Crazy Pants et al. Build your music tech network and connect outside your usual groove. Dimitri is bringing his seismic shift trading cards to spark ideas on music industry upheavals now and in the future. If you're listening to this podcast and you have a South by badge, this meetup is for you. Find details on the South by Southwest schedule. Look for Seismic Shift's Music Tech Networking Meetup. Now, back to the show.
Okay, we're back. And now is the time when I get to grill AnneMarie about her own background, because I'm always excited how people get interested in such specific and yet wide-reaching fields, right? Like, so you're studying something that has a very specific focus on one hand, and yet is a universal part of human experience, and we could argue even like animal experience, right? Because I think I read somewhere that almost all animals have auditory, parts of their brain, but not all of them can see, right? Like blind cavefish. They can hear, but they can't see. Anyway, let's get back to you. How did you get involved in this particular field? What drew you to it?
Well, blind cavefish. No, I'm just kidding.
Had to find out about those cavefish.
So I actually discovered ecomusicology when I was searching for a topic for my final master's recital. I ended up doing a lecture recital since I was studying both musicology and flute performance for my degree. And really, I needed something to center around. And I had the thought, what if we do nature pieces? And really found ecomusicology, a bibliography online, and ended up talking in that recital about approaching flute extended techniques through the imitation of certain quote unquote nature sounds. Like George Crumb has a piece called Voice of the Whale, and at the beginning, the flute is singing and playing simultaneously, and it's meant to be a stylized whale call or whale song. So that was my start, is just thinking, wow, this is really cool. And like we've talked about, there's so many applications of this. It can be, in this case, it was pedagogical, but also helping audiences approach more avant-garde or experimental music. And I think that's really interesting to kind of broaden experiences. I did read the book called Music and the Skillful Listener, American Women Compose the Natural World. This is a book by Denise von Glahn, and it was my introduction to ecomusicology by a musicologist. And then I just started looking at ecomusicologists, and that led me to Dr. Sabina Feist, who is professor at Arizona State University. She is my advisor, and she and Dr. Garth Payne, co-founded and run the Acoustic Ecology Lab at ASU. So the rest is history.
That's really wonderful. You also have a background. Well, you have a background, as you just mentioned, as an artist, as a performer, and I'm curious how that has informed what you do as a scholar. How do those two parts of your life work together?
I love that question. Like, yes, we can be well-rounded people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, in addition to that contemporary flute interest that I have, I really became interested in the music of and the philosophy of American composer Pauline Oliveros. I was just struck by her music, especially her Deep Listening album, which was recorded, it's a collaborative album, recorded in a cistern with like a 45-second reverb. So it's very droney, very meditative. So I was interested in her, found her Sonic Meditations, which are text scores, and discovered her philosophy of deep listening. And deep listening is really this practice based in sound, movement, and dreaming. And it was pioneered by Pauline Oliveros along with her partner, Ione, and dancer Heloise Gold. Something about this practice really intrigued me, and I did some intensive trainings in it. I'm now certified in deep listening. And really, I give all this background because my work as a musician, artist, creative, whatever label you want to use, is in deep listening. And deep listening is my research and my research methodology. So aspects of this deep listening practice inform how I'm researching. So an increased listening, this idea of lift off judgment, of just coming to something very open, the idea of expanding possibilities, of a meditative awareness, of full body experience. These are all principles of the deep listening practice that really go along with how I'm approaching research, how I'm doing research, how I'm even writing about this research. And I do think the methodology grounded in having, like, the researcher is a person, they have ideas and thoughts and an embodied experience. That's something, there's a lot of research about it, but I'm joining others in that specifically from the deep listening perspective.
That's really helpful context. So let's talk a bit about your area of research. What are you exploring in what sounds like actually a pretty wide and diverse field of study?
Yeah, this is why you write the dissertation prospectus, right? Is to answer questions like this. But yeah, so my dissertation research is focusing on listening practices, specifically deep listening, and using deep listening and elements of eco-feminist scholarship to consider 20th and 21st century sound art and experimental music, and specifically art that is including the more than human world. So plants, animals, even like spirits or ghosts, if we want to talk about ancestry in that way too. And with the ecofeminists side of things, there is this idea of care ethics, and that's something I can bring to the research. So embracing non-normative ways of listening and of scholarship. So like I said, acknowledging my positionality as a researcher, that I have cultural and emotional backgrounds that are contributing to how I'm hearing or experiencing or analyzing something. And then sitting with myself and like, how is my body also experiencing this piece or this sound, this music? And I'm really trying to use my desire for an increased awareness in the research process and in talking about these sounds.
Very cool. So we're going to take another quick break here and we'll be right back.
What's the next seismic event on the Music Tectonics calendar? Join us on the first Wednesday of every month for demos of music tech tools for labels and artist managers. With new demos at each event, you'll learn about cutting-edge solutions for music marketing, monetization, rights management, and more. On Wednesday, March 2nd, we're inviting labels and managers to gather for demos from Hi-Fi Labs, a creative team building crazy, cool, never-been-done tech tools and digital experiences for artists of all sizes. And Immersion Networks, whose world-first platform allows the capture, creation, and delivery of next-generation audio experiences. That all goes down March 2nd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll kick off with intros from the audience, so be ready to get on camera and make connections. This is not a lean-back webinar. Register for free and learn more about the Seismic Activities series at musictectonics.com. Now, back to Tristra.
Okay, we're back. And now we get to really have some fun and talk about the nitty-gritty of, now that we've defined ecomusicology, we've heard a little bit about your background, AnneMarie. I'm really excited to talk to you a bit about some of these bigger questions that I'm sure come up regularly in your work or, among your colleagues. So let's talk a bit about listening. As listeners, what can we learn from framing music as part of a bigger soundscape or ecology? Often we tend to segment music into categories or associate it with, say, certain activities that are very much like human activities, such as, I'm commuting, I'm cooking, I'm working out. What does it mean, though, if we take music as part of this bigger auditory or sonic world?
Right. I think that we can understand music as one way to experience sound. That would be the short way to think of it. And part of that is we can apply the listening techniques we use for music in those various contexts, apply those same listening techniques to environments. And then however we're listening to environments, vice versa, we could apply that to listening to music performances. Like you were saying about a whole ecosystem, like listening to a space as a whole and for the relationships that the sounds have within that space can really create or reveal those connections with you in the space, between you and others, between the space itself. And it broadens those experiences that we can then call upon when we're listening to other spaces or musical performances. So I think listening exercises can highlight how we can frame music as part of something bigger. So for example, if you wanted to do a listening exercise, you could zoom in on one small detail. Maybe in a musical setting, that's the oboe. Maybe in a different setting, that's your AC unit rumbling. So you focus on that one sound, and then you can zoom out and listen to the interactions of sounds. So if that's in an orchestral or a chamber music setting, how are the instruments and the players interacting? If that's in maybe a work setting, how is the AC unit combining with someone's keyboard clicking or a chair creaking or a distant car whooshing? So there are applications for performers to use their practice or ensemble work, like the listening practices there, but also audiences can use these types of listening practices when experiencing music or a space. And I think it can also Like, as for another example, maybe we then choose to listen to a rainstorm as a composition. Not that we're imposing a structure on it, but instead incorporating those sounds and those ideas from music to the rainstorm, and then from the rainstorm to music.
That's really cool. Sorry, I was just now I'm just like listening to like the buzz of the lights and like what's making that sound, as well as listening to your words. So I'm curious. We talk a lot about music and tech here, and I don't want to spring this on you out of the blue. I'm curious how you or how others in your field. How do you see this relationship between music and sound and technology? I mean, on one hand, you mentioned this sort of these VR settings that, thanks to more immersive sounds, could really bring people into a location that was very different from the one they were in with the headset on. But at the same time, I know, a lot of acoustic ecologists are concerned about human sounds, the sound of technology, and how that can influence human behavior, human health, like in a hospital setting, et cetera. So I'm wondering, what are some of the scholarly views on technology when it comes to listening to sound environments and that kind of thing? I was wondering if you could share a few thoughts. They don't have to be fully baked. This will not be on your oral exam or something. So.
Oh, thank goodness. No, I think it is interesting, and it can be a split of how people feel about the role of tech and technology. But there's no denying that things like doing field recordings or the ability to share your music or recording on a platform like through the internet, those things are really bringing otherwise potentially unheard sounds and experiences to a wider audience. So I think I don't know where we'd be without the importance of the technology. I think it's interesting to see that the proliferation of things like sound sharing apps, where you can record 4 minutes and 33 seconds in your space and then upload it to the site, and hey, let's listen to that same amount of time in Italy or wherever. Things like that, there are a ton of them. So people are relying, especially artists, are relying on recording technology specifically to share what they're doing and hearing. And I do think, too, it's interesting that some of these artists are also researchers. So I'm thinking of Jana Vinderen. She is currently based in Norway, I believe, and her background is in biology, but she makes these field recordings. Like there's one spring bloom in the marginal ice zone, where it's these tiny, like, who listens to the marginal ice zone? Like, no one's accessing that area of the world. But because she is, and she's a researcher, she's able to bring these really vulnerable ecosystems like that ice zone or the coral reefs. She's able to bring them into a composition and then share them so someone can connect with that space, even though it's inaccessible or maybe you don't have the means to travel there. Just it's a way to share and connect and potentially bring compassion or a desire, that activism aspect again, to a space.
That's really exciting. And it's such an exciting thought to be able to imagine a time when it would be very easy to record, like a completely immersive audio recording of, the ice cracking on a northern river, or or the sound of, like, a really great sound of night in a forest at the equatorial forest where I hear it's pretty raucous.
Right.
So that's like really amazing. It's so cool that people are sharing those experiences too. That's exciting. So that's a very positive aspect of what technology has unlocked for us as listeners and as composers using the recording mode almost as an instrument or a means of composition. Where do you see, or where do some of your colleagues or fellow researchers see problematic moments with music or sound and technology? Like, are there Are there things happening that ecomusicologists are concerned about? I mean, beyond the sheer, like, you can't find a place without human sounds. I mean, that may or may not be a problem depending on how you slice it. But are there ways that we listen now that you would love to transform or shift? Or are there things that, like, if you could wave a magic wand, you wish people could learn to do a little differently in their relationship with technology and the herd environment? Again, this can be purely from you and not necessarily a researcher's perspective, but I'm just curious, what are some of the downsides or the challenges we face in this technologically mediated sound world?
Yes, I think the point you made about not finding a space without human sound is very present in the scholarship, and artists as well have commented on this. It's also worth noting, like, sound itself is not always great. There's research about sound, the decibel levels, either being so loud, so the loudness factor, or just having continuous music. It can be used as torture. There's research about that. So in that way, I mean, the speakers are not being used, and the music itself is not being used in a productive way. But as far as changing something in the future, I think louder plant sounds, this is me personally,
I love it.
Louder plant sounds would be really amazing. And there are tools currently that allow this to happen, microphones and playback that allow people to hear plant sounds. Usually it's in an installation setting, but it has research applications as well. But I don't know, I think an increased sensitivity to what we think of as these really delicate sounds, or sounds we may not even have considered, like a plant sound, because we can't process it as a human, or human hearing, having the means to make that heard and perceptible, I think that would be wonderful. Like, let's hear what all the plants have to say.
I have heard of several different sort of experiments where you can use different sort of like, I think they're like little electrical diodes where you can, like, sort of get the impulses that plants have, that all living creatures have, that flow through them, and turn that into sound, and use basically a plant as a way to generate music.
Yes.
Yeah, but that's not the sound of the plant itself. Well, it is a sound. It's an aspect of the plant sound, but you're not really hearing, I don't know, what does the plant hear as it grows? Questions we've never asked on this podcast.
Yeah, and welcome to my world.
It's pretty cool.
But yeah, it's great. And there are many artists who are miking or interacting with plants in a way that is bringing them to light, but it's very niche. I recognize that. It's not, but I don't know. Maybe Gaga needs to do it, and then we'll all know about it.
I bet she's gonna make a real sick track with some bean sprouts. But I think that one of the, like, just to take a step back, like, the bigger message though is that the sounds of our living companions, not to get too woo about it, on this planet, and the inanimate materials around us, all of those sounds, whether we hear them or we perceive them or not, like, that has something to give us and to teach us, and it makes up our world even if we're not aware of it. Like and perhaps, just to get back to some of the, sound environments that people may be generating over the next 10 years without understanding deeply what those elements are, something's always going to feel off, right? It's like you look at a human face the skin is too regular, and you can tell it's generated by AI, for example. So that uncanny valley of soundless objects that we have to watch out for. Though I think I also love the point you made about continuous stimuli in terms of music or really loud sounds, and the importance that we pay attention to that as we think about technology is important. That's another really valid point.
Yes.
You get some good counterbalance of silence there. That was perfect. Well, looking ahead, where I think a lot of us who get deep into academic research, it's an active imagination in a lot of ways. Whether even if you're looking at the past or doing something like doing sociological surveys, there's a lot of imagination involved. And I'm wondering, when you get maybe after a deep listening session or really good walk, when you get into that space where you're like, wouldn't it be cool someday if? What kind of things do you hear? What kind of things do you imagine?
Besides the bean sprouts that will be sampled. I don't know. I had one, to go back to our kind of woo-woo.
Yeah.
I had one transcendent, I will call it, moment where I felt like I was truly able to hear everything at once. One time it was maybe a second long. And I think that would be like, that's what I hear, is just the understanding of accepting sound and it just making sense. Like, it doesn't have to make sense, but it just does. It exists. And in that existence, it is making sense. I know how I sound right now, but I
think anyone who's who connects deeply to music as a human has gained that transcendence in some way, shape, or form.
Right. And I think that's the powerful part of it, and to incorporate other beings and objects into that experience sounds and seems like I don't even have the right word. It just seems like a beautiful way to move through life and space. So really just switching on, and if everybody were able to tap into that and encourage their own listening, how it would sound so different. Like, we would potentially could make so much change in relationships and in cultivating space and place for those who are usually silenced or hard to hear.
That's a wonderful thought.
I'm getting too deep into my thoughts.
No, I love it. I love it. I think that's an important place. That's an important place to go, and it's easy to forget that's one of music's original goals, was to take us there. So thanks for going there with me, AnneMarie. This was a really wonderful conversation. And listeners, I hope you've listened deeply, both to the words and whatever background sound you might hear. Thanks so much for joining us for Music Tectonics today.
Thank you, Trisha.
Thanks for listening to Music Tectonics. If you like what you hear, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app. We have new episodes for you every week. Did you know you can dig deeper into all our episodes with the show notes at musictectonics.com. While you're there, look for the latest about our annual conference, sign up for our newsletter to get updates, or get the Music Tectonics app for music tech news. Everything we do explores seismic shifts that shake up music and technology the way the Earth's tectonic plates cause quakes and make mountains. Connect with Music Tectonics on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and find me, Dmitry Vitsa, if you can spell it, on LinkedIn. Bye-bye!
You're listening to Music Tectonics.